Hello everybody, welcome back to your Pro Tools lesson with me, McKay Tebbs. And today we're going to be talking about mixing. We're specifically going to be going over the Pro Tools 101 Handbook Lesson 8, Getting Started with Mixing. And I'm first going to do that by explaining some things to you, just right here in the video. And then at the end I'm going to have a demonstration where I show you some of these things in a mix. So when it comes to the basics of mixing, there are a few steps we're going to go through to be able to do an effective mix. So when it comes to the basics of mixing, there are a few steps to go through to do a basic mix. And step one is setting your levels, and that's the faders, so adjusting those levels. And along with that is also setting the panning. So we're going to talk about setting the levels and panning. After that, you want to carve out a frequency range for each track, and the way you do that is by applying EQ to the tracks. And that allows each track to be heard clearly if you do it right. Beyond that, the next step would be adding dimension elements like delay and reverb. And when you add delay and reverb, it kind of expands the sound and makes it bigger, and it lets that it makes your mix sound deeper and wider. And so we're going to be talking about how to do that with a mix. Some other key elements to always remember and be aware of. Avoid clipping. So clipping is bad, it's not good. And the best place to start avoiding clipping is when you're capturing your sound, when you start recording it. So it's important that you always look at the meter and stay in the green, and don't let the meter get too hot right in the beginning. But what happens in the mixing stage is you start adding plugins to the mix to adapt or improve the sound in some way, and some of those plugins are add volume into that track. And so you have to be careful as you're adding plugins that that track doesn't start clipping, and you have to check that. Another thing to be aware of is the master fader, and you want to make sure you always include a master fader in your session. And also always make sure that the master fader is the highest raised fader in a track. So don't have the other faders above where the master fader is set. And that is another thing that will help you to avoid clipping. So with those things in mind, I guess I also want to share a brief history about mixing with you. There's terms that are used called in the box and out of the box. The box referring to a computer box, mixing in the box, mixing out of the box. And mixing out of the box was what was done historically when recordings were made with reel-to-reel tape tracks involved, and then a real-life mixing console in the room. And the live mixing console had knobs and faders that you could touch with your hands and move back and forth. So that's mixing out of the box. Mixing in the box is doing it all in your computer DAW. The cool thing about mixing in the box is now you have all the tools available to create a well-crafted, professional sounding mix without having to pay thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. Historically, the only way to get professional sounding mixes was to buy all the hardware and put that in your studio, and it was very costly and expensive. So we're obviously going to be mixing in the box in Pro Tools and using the tools that are available there to create this mix. So before we get started mixing though, we need to talk a little bit about signal flow and how the signal flow is going to travel inside of Pro Tools. So here's our Pro Tools 110 book, and here's the page where it talks about signal flow. And I just want to bring your attention over here to the fader channel strip where it has everything numbered. So starting with number 1 right here. And what the signal flow is it's the audio signal. So if you think about your audio signal as a river, that river has to flow in certain directions to get where it needs to go. So when you're in the process of recording your sound or capturing it from the microphone, it's coming in the input. So in this part of your mixer, you have the I/O, input and output. So this number 1 would be the input. This number 7 here is the output. And notice that 7 is the last number, or in other words, the signal is going to come in the input, go to a whole bunch of other places, and at the end of that comes out the output. So that's where your input and outputs are. After the signal comes in the input, it then goes through the inserts that you have in your mix. So at the top of your of your channel strip, there's these blank spaces here where you can put plugins on there, or inserts, and those will affect the sound. For example, if you put a reverb on those inserts, then you're going to have a reverb sound coming in right there. The next place your signal goes is to 3 and 5, which is the pre-fader send and the post-fader send, and you can decide which of those it is. That's why it's 3 and 5. But these sends are sending the signal somewhere else to be sent right back immediately. And what usually happens with the sends is that you're sending it to an aux input track, and on that aux input track you probably have an effect wired, or you probably have an effect selected and being used. And after it goes to that aux input track, it comes back to this track with that effect now on it. After that, you can officially start raising and lowering the fader here to increase or decrease the volume level of your signal. You can also start tweaking the panning knob to place the signal in a certain area of your mix. And then finally, after it's gone through all of those elements, it reaches number 7, where it goes to the output. And that output is usually routed to whatever the main output is of your master fader. And so that way your master fader can control what's happening in the session. So here I'm working on a session that has 3 instruments in it. It has string instruments, cello, viola, and violin, and they're all playing together. I'm going to switch over here to the mix window, and here's the mix window. And the first thing we want to do is to set the levels. Right now, all the levels are set to 0 decibels. You see how they're all right there? We have another word for 0 decibels, and that is unity. And so they're all set at unity. And if you start adjusting the faders and pulling them places, just want to show you this unity click thing you can do to get it back to 0 in a hurry. If you adjust a fader somewhere and you want to get it back to 0, you just hold down Option and click on that fader, and it will immediately go back to 0. It's called the unity click, and just hold down Option and click. But the first thing to do is to set those levels, and the only way you can set those levels is by listening to them. And so you're going to have to push play, and then once you're listening to it, you're going to start adjusting what you hear. Okay, so now I'm listening to my track, I'm listening to the music. I'm adjusting things to see where they are. Right off the bat, I can hear that the cello is kind of doing a bass line. It's not doing the melody. I probably want the melody to be the loudest thing. The viola is kind of doing some chordal type things, once again not doing the melody. Ah, there it is. So it's that violin that's playing the melody. I probably want that to be the loudest thing here. So now, I'm just going to pull down these other elements. Okay, now remember what I said about always making sure the master fader is the highest fader. I'm going to adjust that up, and that will increase the overall volume of what I'm hearing at the moment. Okay. Okay, so now I've got kind of a static mix going on where I have a nice level set where I can basically hear everything. Let's talk a little bit about the panning now. And before I do panning, I just want to explain that when it comes to panning, you're basically trying to get everything from being in the center where it starts, or from being hard right and hard left where it starts. And everything needs to have its special spot in the mix so that it can be heard clearly. If you pan everything to the same area, they're all going to be fighting for attention right there. You're not going to hear everything clearly. So an example to think about is go to a concert. Let's say you're at a concert and you're seeing the band play on stage. Who is center stage when you're looking up at that stage? Well, first of all, the lead vocalist is, right? The singer. They're right in the center. They're right in the front. Who's right behind them? The drummer is. The drummer is right behind the singer. And the interesting thing about when you're panning is it's kind of that same scenario. You want the lead instrument or the lead vocals usually to be center, and then on the drum set you want to have the kick drum be center and the snare drum be center. And if you think about it, the frequencies that a kick and snare generate are way different from the frequencies that a vocalist generates. So that's why they can occupy the same space and yet be separate from each other. And one more thing to have in that center area is the bass, because the bass kind of works in tandem with the kick drum. Those two things should always be linked together in whatever your mix is. Now the other elements, if you're thinking about that stage, you've got keyboards over here, guitar over here, and maybe anything else in the band. The other elements can be placed anywhere else in the mix, and they should be placed differently from each other. And in that way, when you're listening to a mix, everything's going to have its special spot there. And so we want to kind of do that with the panning. That's where that happens, is with the panning. So I'm going to apply that to my mix now. I'm going to come here. My violin is the lead, so I'm going to leave my violin straight in the center. Here's my viola. I'm going to pan the viola kind of right at about 3 o'clock right, and I'm going to take that cello and pan it left at about 9 o'clock, like if we're thinking of it as a clock dial. I'm going to listen to it now. That's great. That's great. I hear my violin right in the middle. I hear both the other instruments right on the side of everything. But I'm also noticing that now that it's been panned, the volume's not quite right. I'm going to adjust the fader again. I'm going to lift up that cello so I can hear the bass a lot better, the bass line part. Okay, and now I have that set. So now I can start working on carving out the frequency range, and I'm going to probably just do this one at a time. I'm going to start by soloing the violin, so pushing the S, and I'm going to get an insert here, an EQ insert, and we're going to go EQ 7 band. Now right off the bat, I know that a violin is kind of a high frequency instrument, so it would make sense that I want to emphasize the frequencies on this side of the spectrum rather than this side, the low side, where something like the cello would live. So I'm going to come up here and I'm just going to start. I'm going to start by raising these frequency bands up. I'm going to adjust it to make it a little bit sharper. And now let's hear what that violin sounds like with the high frequencies accentuated. If I sweep down here, I can hear that change a lot. But I can definitely tell that up here in this higher range is that, to me, that's where that's going to sound the best. So I'm going to leave it right there. So think of this EQ window as a left to right, low to high band range. So if your instrument is a high frequency range instrument, be over here on the right side. If it's low frequency, be over here on the left side. And if it's kind of in the middle, then you want to emphasize the middle area. If you don't really know where to start, you can always click here on the presets, and you could come here and, for example, you could find strings, and on my strings I want to add air or add sizzle. I mean, you know, you could start working from the presets too. But solo one instrument at a time and add EQ to each instrument, and use your ear as the guide, and you decide what makes it sound best, how much EQ and what kind of EQ to apply to make it sound best. We're going to do that on the viola now. I'm going to solo it, and now I'm going to hold down Option, and I'm going to take this EQ and I'm going to just drag it and drop it in the insert net. So holding down Option, dragging an insert and dropping it where you want it is a great way to not have to go through that process of picking it again, and it's just a time saver. So I'm going to open it up, I'm going to start listening, and I'm going to find a good range that sounds good. Maybe I'll put a little bit of highs in there too. Okay, now I have some EQ set on the viola, and last of all, I'm going to do that for the cello. I'm going to solo it and unsolo this. I'm going to hold down Option, drag it over, drop it, open it up. So here's my cello playing now. I'm going to raise up some of these lower frequencies. Oh yeah. Okay, so now I heard it get a lot deeper, and I just kind of like that timbre a lot, so I'm going to keep it like that. And so now I have shaped the sound. I've kind of made each of these instruments sound a little bit clearer. I've got the level set, I've got the panning set, I've got the EQ set. So next comes the dimension. We can add some delay and reverb, but before I do that, I am going to create a subgroup of these tracks. Now what happens is, at the moment, all three tracks, their volume is separate from each other, so if I move one fader, then the other faders aren't going to move, so it is going to affect the overall volume. By creating a subgroup of these three tracks, I can move one fader and have it move all three volume faders up and down. Well, it doesn't actually move their volume faders up and down. But let me show you how to do it, and you do it by creating an aux input track. So I'm going to click here, and I'm going to create an aux input track. It's right here. Drop it there. And that part was easy enough, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to route these three string tracks into my aux input track. And the way you do that is with the outputs on the three string track and the input on the aux track. First of all, let's name this aux track. We're going to call it string submix. Okay, so I've got my string submix here. Now I'm going to come over here to the input. Right now it says no input, so I need to assign an input. When you click on it to assign an input, you have a choice of doing the inputs from the 1 and 2. That's your audio interface input. But this is where you want to use the buses. So these buses are how you connect the tracks together. And if I scroll up here to the top, I have bus 1 and 2. So I'm just going to pick bus 1 and 2 there. All right, and now you see that the input here says bus 1 and 2. Now, it's a good idea to rename the bus, and the reason you want to rename that bus is because you're going to end up using a lot of buses, and rather than remembering that bus 1 and 2 is the string submix, you could just rename it string submix, and then where you're looking for it, it's immediately going to pop out in the list. So I'm going to right click on bus 1 and 2 and click this option that says rename, and I'm going to call it string submix. And now you'll see that the name of it changed to that. All right, the next thing I'm going to do is highlight all three of these tracks at the same time, or select all three of them. If you click on their nameplate, you'll select them. If you hold down Shift, you can click across the range of nameplates and select all of them at the same time. And the reason we're going to do that is that way when we're selecting the output right here, we can select one time rather than 3 times. In other words, when you're creating a submix, sometimes you have like 10 tracks and you're trying to route them in the same place, and who wants to do it 10 times in a row, right? So this is a time saver. A keyboard command, Option Shift. If you hold down Option and Shift while you're selecting, then it will apply that selection to all the tracks that are highlighted. Okay, so I am going to select the string submix for all these tracks together. So to do that, I'm going to click, but before I click, I'm going to hold down Shift and Option. So here goes Shift and Option, pushing them down. Now I click on one of them, and I come here and I select string submix. And it changes all 3 of those tracks to say string submix. So now all 3 of these string tracks are routed to the input of my aux input track. So once again, the benefit of doing this is now I can move this fader on this aux input track, this string submix track, and it will affect the overall volume of all the string tracks. So I just turned it off, and now I'm turning it on. Oops, I had this one soloed, so I wasn't actually hearing all three together. So now I can hear the overall volume of all three of those tracks together. Now I turned it off. Now I turned it on. Okay, at this point you might be thinking, what's the point of having an aux input submix track when you already have the master fader track? And that's exactly what it's doing. This current example is a small session, right? It's just got 3 string tracks in it and that's it. So you're right, maybe in this current session I don't actually need to create a string submix, but you're going to be working in larger sections where you're going to have a group of string tracks, a group of guitar tracks, a group of drum tracks, a group of synth tracks, or anything else. I mean, you could have 20, 30, 40, you could have lots of tracks here. So each group of tracks would need its own submix, and then you set the levels on the submix, and then you use the master fader to control the overall level of all those submixes, all those tracks together. So yeah, so it's going to become really handy in that case. Alright, now that I have my submix track created, I can now start adding effects that will make my strings sound better. And one of the first effects I want to add is reverb. So I'm going to come up here to this insert here, and I'm going to select the reverb insert, and we'll try the deverb. Okay, so now when I push play, we should hear some reverb on this. Oh yeah, I'm hearing it with the reverb. It's definitely there. However, I'm not particularly in love with this first go around of the type of reverb. It sounds like it's too much, so I need to tweak with it to make it sound great. Alright, so after playing with this for a few seconds, I've come up with a sound that I like. Just want to show you that right here we have wet and dry, and this wet and dry is controlling how much reverb I have in there. So dry would be not very much, wet would be probably too much, right? So you have to find a nice balance to decide how much reverb to add to it. Okay, so now I've got some reverb there. It's sounding pretty good. So let's go ahead and add some delay now. So we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to come down to the next insert. I'm going to select delay, and I'm going to go mod delay 3. Let's try that one. So I'm going to push play so I can hear it in action. Alright, so now I have it. Okay, alright, so now I have a nice little echo happening here, but it's too much. I don't want it to be an obvious delay. I want it to be kind of more underneath things. So first of all, I'm going to pull it down in the mix. I'm going to change it from quarter note to eighth note. Maybe I'll come to 16th note and try that. Then I can turn it up just a little more. Yeah, it's still too much. So there's a lot of tweaking here, and it's up to you to experiment and twist the knobs and push the buttons and trust your ear. Make sure that it sounds good to your ear, and that's how you know when you're done. That's how you know when you found it. But anyway, with this submix created, we have added delay and reverb just to that aux track. Without that submix, we would have had to add delay and reverb to each track individually. And we could have done that, but one of the things to consider as you add inserts is processing power. Every time you add an insert, your computer has to soak up more processing power to process that insert on there. So sometimes having the submix can be valuable because it's going to conserve your computer's ability to process your Pro Tools session. Alright, thanks for coming to this lesson today and learning a little bit about mixing with me in Pro Tools. That's it for now. My name is McKay Tebbs, and I'll see you in the next video.